Christophe's Story by Nikki Cornwell. The first day of school. "You'll be fine," Papa said. Christophe looked through the gates at his new school. His legs didn't want to move. "You remember which way to go?" "Yes, Papa." "Smile. You look as if you've eaten bad meat." Christophe tried to smile. "Good. Now off you go. Miss Finch is waiting for you." Forcing himself to turn away from Papa, Christophe walked across the deserted playground. He was 8 years old and he hadn't been to school for 2 years. He entered the classroom. All the children turned and stared, and the teacher stopped talking. She smiled at Christophe and said, "There you are." Christophe nodded politely. His cheeks felt as though they were burning. "This is Christophe," Miss Finch told the class. "He has come from a country in Africa called Rwanda, and he is joining our class. Say good morning, Christophe." "Good morning, Christophe," the children chanted. "Sit there next to Greg." Miss Finch pointed to an empty place. The chair scraped over the floor as Christophe pulled it towards him. Nobody spoke. He felt as if everyone was looking at him. Miss Finch set the children some work to do. Then she came to talk to Christophe. He had eyes as blue as the sky, long silky hair the colour of corn, and pale pink skin. When she smiled, he thought that the sun had risen. "You speak lots of languages, don't you?" she said. "Who taught you to speak English?" "My papa did. He can speak French and English and Kinyarwanda. He's a clever man. What kind of work does he do?" "He's a doctor, but he doesn't work now." "Oh," said Miss Finch. She gave a little cough. Placing an open book on the table before him, she said, "You haven't been to school for a long time, have you? Don't worry, you'll soon catch up. Let's see what you can tell me about this story." "A story? In a book? But stories shouldn't be written down. That's what Babby said." Christophe felt sick. He stared at the black swiggly patterns on the ink on the white pages. Didn't his teacher know about stories? A storm began to blow up inside him. "I don't like reading," he said. "Don't you?" Miss Finch said softly. "I'll read it to you. Watch my finger. I'll point at each of the words as I say it." The teacher's pink fingertip slid over the page. The words dropped from her red lips and fell like grains of sand to the ground. He listened, he watched, he waited, but nothing happened. It wasn't like the stories that Babby told. When Babby told stories, Christophe saw pictures in the sky. But here in the classroom there were no pictures, only a heap of words that dropped from the teacher's mouth and piled upon the floor. Babby was right. Stories should not be written down. "It will be great when you can read it for yourself," said Miss Finch. Why would it be great? Christophe couldn't understand what she meant. "Greg, will you show Christophe where to go for dinner?" said Miss Finch. Greg led Christophe to a room with tables and benches. There was a smell of food cooking that made his stomach turn over with hunger. He sat down next to Greg. Greg moved away as if he didn't want to be close to him. There was a girl on the other side. With dark curls. She gave a sly look, whispered something to her friend, and both girls giggled. This made him feel hot and uncomfortable. He sat in silence, listened to the chatter around him. He could understand most of what was being said, but then, when they all talked at once, his head grew full of noise and his eyes ached. When Christophe had finished eating, he went out into the playground with the other children. It was a cold, grey day. There was no sun, no colour in the air. Some of the boys were playing football. He didn't dare join in. What if they told him to go away? Christophe wandered up and down the railings. All around him there were children laughing, jumping and shrieking with excitement. They all had someone to play with except him. If only they were back on the side of a mountain, looking after Babby's 2 goats. He had never felt lonely with Namo and Munga. At last it was the end of the school day. Mama and Papa were there at the gates. Christophe ran to Mama and gave her a hug. "Comment ça va?" said Mama. "Speak English, Bibka," Papa said to her. "We're in England now." "Is everything going well, Christophe? Is your teacher nice?" "Yes, Papa, but you read a story from a book. Babby says you mustn't write stories down." Ah, Babby, said Papa. His eyes looked wet. Papa, when will Babby come see me? Asked Christophe. Babby can't come at present, mon petit. Why not? His leg is not strong enough, and it's a long way to come. And also there's the war. I hate the war, cried Christophe. Qu'est-ce dit-il? Said Mamma. What did he say? He says that he hates the war, Papa said. Ah, Mamma's face grew heavy. Mamma and Papa were often sad. It was because of the war, or maybe it was because little Matthew had been killed. Christophe took Mamma's hand and pressed his cheek against it. Can we go to the park on the way home? Mamma's face softened. Yes, why not? Said Papa. Christophe saw the smile come back to her eyes, and he knew that the sadness had gone. But it was sure to come back. If only he could make it go away for good. Each day Miss Finch made him sit down with a book. Christophe hated it. He couldn't hear Babby's words in his ears. Babby had said to him, each time you tell a story, the spirit of the person who told you the story is standing behind you, and behind him there is the spirit of the person who told him the story. And each time you tell a story, they help you to make pictures in the sky. Don't write it down. Don't put it in a book, or the pictures will fade. Why did Miss Finch want him to do something that was wrong? A bad spirit must have got into her. That's what Babby would say. That's a baby book, said a scornful voice. It's got pictures in it. The words came from a boy with a big voice called Jeremy, who was always getting told off by Miss Finch. Christophe didn't know what to say. He felt his cheeks grow hot. Greg looked up from his book and said, Shove it, jelly knees. Jeremy made a rude sign with his hand and walked away. He's no good, said Greg. He supports Arsenal. What team do you support, Arsenal or Spurs? Spurs, said Christophe quickly. He had no idea what Greg meant. Yeah, up with the Spurs, grinned Greg. Have you finished with the chapter, Greg? Said Miss Finch. No. Then you shouldn't be talking to Christophe. Christophe tried to focus on his book, but all he could think of was whether Greg would let him play football when they went out to play. And because he wasn't concentrating, he was slow to finish what he had to do. That meant he was one of the last children to join the queue for lunch, and was separated from Greg. With a sinking heart, he saw Jeremy had followed him into the queue. Behind Jeremy there were three mean-looking boys who were always with him. They had cold, unfriendly eyes, and they reminded Christophe of especially unpleasant rats. They sat down on the benches. Plates of spaghetti were passed down the table. Worms, cried Jeremy. That's what you eat from where you're from, isn't it? Yeah, that's what they eat in Africa, tittered one of the rats. Christophe tried to ignore them. He picked up his fork and took a mouthful of his dinner. He had just loaded up the second mouthful when Jeremy pulled a tissue out of his pocket and dropped a dead worm on Christophe's plate. Have another one, seeing as you like 'em so much. Christophe dropped his fork. He felt his stomach heave. The rats fell about laughing. Jeremy scooped up the worm in his grubby fingers and shoved it back into his pocket. What's the matter? Said the dinner lady. Nothing, miss, chorused the rats. The rats shot little looks at Christophe and grinned at each other. Then they turned away and ignored him. He sat all alone, his spaghetti growing cold on the plate in front of him. He couldn't eat another mouthful. You've hardly touched your dinner, said the dinner lady when she got back. I don't want it, Christophe said. You can leave it today, I suppose, she grumbled, but don't make a habit of it. Out you go, all of you. Greg was already in the playground playing football. Christophe wrapped his arms round his chest. He was starving hungry, his stomach was rumbling. If only Greg would let him play. The football came flying over the playground. It cannoned into his chest, almost knocking him to the ground. Greg came running towards him. Sorry, Chris, he said. I didn't mean to hit you. Do you want to play? Christophe's heart did a somersault. Yes, please, he said. Well, said Papa. Was it a good day? Said Mamma. I played football, Christophe told them. But he didn't tell them about Jeremy. That's the end of chapter 1 today. Chapter 2 tomorrow.